Yeah, so to get the camera to show up on the XYZ display, I patched the horizontal ramp to a processor and the vertical ramp to a processor, and then those two ramps to a scaler doing 1 to 5 volt, and then those into X and Y. So you can use the scaler to decide how big it shows up. And this display needs them both inverted. So I use the processor is going negative on both of those. And then the Luma from the camera is going to a mixer, and then to the scaler doing 1 to 5 volts again, and then to the Z input. So if I mix the Luma into the Z, that's bringing the brightness up and down. And if I mix the Luma into the X and Y, we get like the 3D effects. And then if you turn the gain up, you can zoom in, and then on the processor that's driving the X and Y, you can use the bias to go find things. So here we're sort of like panning around the picture. Turn the brightness up a little bit. That's good. Now it's even more obvious when you start adding a little bit of Luma into X and Y. So you really just want some kind of mixer with a 10U so you can invert the ramps. I'll show you what happens if we don't invert the ramps. It just shows up upside down. So I have them both positive now. Let me find the thing again. Yeah, it just shows up flipped horizontally and vertically.
More you know.
So that's the basic patch. Here, I'm gonna repatch and do another.
Okay.
So this patch is the same as the last one, except now the horizontal and vertical ramps are going through Navigator, and Navigator set to spin. If I turn the spin off, Navigator just does the rotation. Put it back on spin, and then the two modes of Navigator either do this kind of like 3D flippy thing or just a straight rotation. So in a straight rotation, you just spin yourself around there. If we make it a little bigger in this mode, you can just get a nice little spin. Put it back in spin mode. And then in this mode, if we zoom in a little by putting some more gain on it before we hit the X and the Y, if we start adding in the Luma to the X and Y, it kind of gets like a 3D rotation effect. Maybe do a little more subtle. Get myself back in the middle. And then if we do in the other mode, it looks really 3D. I'll slow that spin down a little. And then crank up the amount of Luma that's hitting it. So when it flattens out, it really looks super 3D. Yes, I'll just leave it. Yeah, it almost looks like you're kind of looking at it from the side, and it's still 3D. Where am I? Oh, there. I'm sort of upside down here. Get it back spinning. And then I still have the processors after the Navigator, so you can shrink it down, zoom it way out, and move it up and down side to side with the processor.
Crazy.
So that's, yeah. And then navigator also now can move things side to side, up and down, and then you can change the anchor point of what it's spinning on. So if we make it small, there in the middle, crank up the spinny speed. If we change the anchor point, it starts spinning more around the screen. Slow that down. Take out the luma. You can see that's still me talking in the picture there. And we could add a ton of luma into the X and Y. Get some pretty wild stuff. I'm gonna take the luma out, and we're just back to me. All right, so that's the navigator in there. Okay, so in this patch, I can mix an oscillator into the X and Y inputs after navigator. So navigator is still doing the spinning. And I have just a square wave oscillator. So if I mix that into X and Y, it displaces the image in X and Y. And it's sort of making two planes. And if we crank up the frequency of the square wave, you can really see like the two planes where the oscillator is high and low. It makes those funky laser beams in between. If I crank the oscillator all the way up, you can really see those like two parallel planes where the oscillator is high and low. And this is a prismatic ray, so if I do the pedestal, it will crossfade fully between one and the other one. So I'm like zipping back and forth between the two. If I turn the frequency of the oscillator down, you can see more. Ooh, that looks like a slinky. I'm like slinking my face up and down. There, down there, up there, down there. That's close to 50-50 again. And we could probably still add in luma into X and Y. We get some of that 3D effect. And if I play with the oscillator, you can see that the two planes again. Center it. You can zoom in. And you really slow down that rotation. Get some wild 3D. That's my hand in the camera. Actually, I'm just going to freeze it and like, find my own rotation points. There's Nate's hand. Zoom way in. So zooming in is just changing the gain of the output of navigator to the X and Y inputs. And then scrolling around is just changing the bias to the X and Y. There's just some funky 3D stuff in here. I'm gonna take a wall outlet. That's us there somewhere. And then if we just zoom out, center it, and zoom out, center. Take off the luma to X and Y. Take out that oscillator to X and Y. And we're just back to the navigator. If we put navigator in the other mode, it actually just rotates. So we can turn it back into a TV. There. Now it's a TV again. Thanks, Nate.
Yeah, man.
So this patch starts with Visual Cortex, and I have my ramp generator switches in the middle on both, and I'm using the horizontal and vertical ramps. And then I have a camera plugged in, and I'm just using the Luma output. And then eventually I ended up with H&V going into Navigator, and then H&V coming out of Navigator. And those are hitting the inputs on these two processors. So this is X and this is Y. So then the zooming, so the gain, is these attenuverters here. And then the scrolling around or panning is the bias on those two. And the outputs of these two are hitting the scaler, which is a 1 to 5 volt scaler. And then the scaler is hitting this Euro to BNC for X, Y, and Z. And then those go to the Tektronix 604A. And the Tektronix wants something in between 1 and 5 to fill the screen, X and Y. So having the processor before the 1 to 5 scaler lets you fit it or zoom in or zoom out. You kind of need more gain than just the processor by itself. And similarly, the Z input really likes the 5 volt output from the scaler. The 1 volt output from Cortex would be pretty dim on this display. Yeah, and then I was using color chords to mix other signals into my X and Y. So I was using the through inputs on the processors from color chords, and then I had Luma and the oscillator going in here. And I was using color chords as a matrix mixer to mix Luma and the oscillator onto the X and Y.
And that's rescanning.
Yep. Yeah.
There it is.